These words are just a short one-person sequel to that great play, Nothing Really Happens, by Meencher Natira, produced by Dr. Eddie Malloy. Not quite as scintillating, perhaps, but I was struck when I was asked to come by Joe Mulholland by the question, and thinking about the question and listening to the speeches and the Cure at Troy last night and Eddie Malloy's play this morning, is there is a context to the question. There's a context to our condition. And the context, I think, is that underlying simplicity that Cree grew up in, that we believe from the inside out. The underlying narrative of our national foundation is, if only we could be free, all would be well. And when we ask the question, when we put it as we have today and over the days ahead, about how do we restore credibility in our institutions, there is a parallel underlying assumption that if only we could be free of an unfit apparatus, all would be well. There has never been a concurrent acceptance of responsibility personally, nationally or institutionally in the history of the state, in the history of our institutions, or in the history of our interaction as citizens with the apparatus and the politics and the public policy of our state. The institutional malaise we are talking of at such length is fundamentally an effect. It's not the cause of our underlying concern. It is the evidence, not the crime. The continuing conversation about the need, which I believe in, to reform our institutions acts as a continuation by another means of that rhetoric on which our state was founded, that assumption that responsibility and therefore blame always is somewhere else. But someone else is not to blame. We are to blame. We, the people, are sovereign. The narrative that places a primary or even exclusive blame on politicians, on the political system, is inherently about shifting responsibility rather than accepting it. People in responsibility, and there have been several excellent pointers to this already this morning, should, if our institutions were capable, be held responsible. But personal responsibility is largely evaded because in our institutions responsibility is porous. Absorbed as systematic failure, it nearly always excuses any personal liability. But industrial schools, Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes, bigger mortgages based on ever higher multiples of wages, a relentless demand for higher wages to fund them, a greater level of public spending to sustain the lot, were all founded on popular demand, each in its own time, and some of those times are embarrassingly recent, were policies based on widespread public support. The property bubble was an ultimate expression of an almost demented demand for security and status in a culture that is fundamentally extraordinarily insecure. That culture grafted onto a reckless explosion of credit, for which there has never been any effective reckoning, accumulated in the calamity that was our economic collapse. And our flawed institutions, they mirrored all of that then, and they mirror us now. The problem with our politics and our political institutions is not, ladies and gentlemen, that they are out of touch, is that they are hardwired to the popular will to an extent that makes sustaining policy difficult and ultimately seemingly impossible. Irish politicians are not an alien class. They are eerily, in their weaknesses, fully representative of us. And the serial post facto self-absolution of public responsibility is hypocrisy. The rowing back already from the central commitment to put the public finances first on a sound footing, the reliance on economic growth that is as yet still anemic, and which for the future has yet to be realised, to reduce debt reduction targets is a massive fiscal gamble going forward. It is the Russian roulette we swore at the height of our recent crisis we were never going to play again. But it seems we are. So who is to blame? Is it them, or is it actually us? Having myself enjoyed a misspent youth in politics, it never fails to amaze me how politicians scramble for so long to get elected, to get promoted, and then fail to exercise power when it arrives. Tactics become strategy, the chase becomes the ultimate object. Generations of Irish politicians, expertly practiced in a system that ultimately fails, are afraid to contemplate changing it. The broken promise of the last election, the one that matters most, because I believe, and I want to say again, as I've said repeatedly, that to date this government's management of this economy has been sound and is praiseworthy. But the broken promise that matters most is the promise not fulfilled of a democratic revolution. We voted in 2011 for the third largest turnover of parliamentary seats in any Western democracy since the Second World War. It was on a change unseen in Ireland since 1918. There was an assumption that Ireland was signing up for institutional revolution. It never happened, and here we are seemingly on the verge back to where we were before, but different in the sense that what was there before can never, in fact, be replenished. It is irretrievably gone forever. And a weakness at the heart of Irish politics, upon which pivots recurring cycles of popular demand, political promise, and eventual retribution, is the multi-seat constituency. The 2011 election was an aberration. The last landslide victory before that was in 1977. The norm of Irish politics, the one I predict we arrived at, is where a handful of votes in a handful of constituencies change government. But changing this system, had it been contemplated, but it wasn't, would have been the single most important reform of our politics. Single-seat constituencies, based on proportional representation, would perceptibly reduce the pressures that repeatedly and inevitably lead to short-term and wrong decision-making. But that, regrettably, is now a what-if. It is not going to happen. What was actioned was a constitutional referendum to strengthen the power of Oireachtas committees. This was to ensure our legislature would more effectively interrogate issues and hold office holders to account. But in an act of overreach, that proposal was effectively poisoned and voted down by the people. An opportunity for considered reform that would have both enhanced accountability and respected the rights of citizens has unfortunately been allowed go. Similarly lost was a constitutional referendum to abolish the Seanad. And Seanad Éireann, in its current form, I think, is really part of our institutional debris. It's a useful but strictly limited platform for alternative views. It has enormous potential to enhance connectivity with a disillusioned electorate. There remains, however, an unrealised potential, and regrettably there are no meaningful signs that the government, disgruntled at losing the referendum, is up for real reform in the future. There's a wealth of constructive analysis about how that reform might be carried forward, not least from Senators Fergal Quinn and Catherine Sapone, and their detailed proposal for a universal franchise within the existing constitutional framework, in my view, is worth examining. But in any event, I do believe, after the Seanad referendum, the government has an obligation, if it's not prepared to accept that proposal, to come up with another and equally radical alternative. The lessons of those lost referenda are manifold, but two stand out for me. Firstly, the people are not prepared to place politicians in the judgment seat to arbitrate on the reputation of citizens. Secondly, disillusioned as people may be, there is a desire for better politics. As many of us will know from a self-examination of conscience, a reluctance to face responsibility is not incompatible with a desire to do better in the future. The nexus of political power, however, in this country is in the Dáil. It is here that our system is weakest, in most need of reform, and where immediate steps can, if taken, bring improvements. And our parliamentary system is based on a government enforcing its power as an executive over the legislature. It simultaneously in a double-sided weakness, fails to enforce effective accountability on the apparatus of state over which it presides. And by holding the public service in a bear hug, too tight to allow either for real responsibility or for frank, unfiltered advice, the capability of our public service to realise its potential for responsibility as well as accountability is neutered. And this is a Faustian pact. It derives from a 19th century model where ministers could supposedly, in theory, account for the administration as well as the policies of their departments. But in the vastly enlarged modern technocratic reach of the state, this is simply impossible. And as events demonstrated, by 2011, the lack of clear demarcation between political responsibility for policy decisions on one hand and administration and policy advice on the other had mutated into reputational destruction for all concerned. What is required is much more accountability and much more responsibility at every level. The Fiscal Advisory Council is a welcome, tentative step in the right direction. Its existence does not oblige government to take a particular policy line, but its independent advice creates a positive pressure point, in my view, in the system. It also ensures that a government that exercises its prerogative to ignore that advice can be held to account against an effective, open, clear benchmark. Politicians who, when in government, who repeatedly fail to reform and strengthen processes of parliamentary and administrative accountability, mistakenly think they are protecting their own political prerogative. But there's a fundamental connection because of this fear-failure nexus of politics and power, in opposition always promising to do it and power never doing. This is the fundamental connection between the politics that failed then and which continues to underdeliver now. The grasping and the insecurity at the heart of our society lives on as a legacy in how we continue to exercise power in this country today. In Ireland, the government of the day is unchallenged in Parliament by any systematic oversight, and the continuing, almost abject failure of Oireachtas committees to effectively scrutinise budgets and departments of which they are supposed to preside over is truly astonishing. There's a lack of seriousness and purpose, mirrored, I might say, by absolutely horrible lack of resources for these backbench TDs on those committees. And all in all, given that there's little media interest, apparently no public interest, better off then to holler and high kick about Gareth Brooks getting stuck in over days to impenetrable estimates that actually do at the end affect public policy and the public finances. Government is also institutionally unchallenged within by the expert resource who should be giving advice free from the political pressure that surrounds every government. There's a cohabitation of mutual malaise between governments in power and their civil servants. It's not political, it's not personal, it's institutional. It's an oblique exchange of favours where neither side adequately challenges the other or fulfils its full potential to serve the country better. A strengthening of the Dáil and of its committees, the transparent framework to hold senior management to account and obliges them and enables them critically, as well as obliges them to advise more independently and frankly, would be positive pressures for the development of better policy. In refusing to cut through the fog of who in fact is accountable for what in our system, nobody, as I said, is really accountable for anything. And breaking that cycle would ultimately strengthen our politics and it would strengthen our policy making. Electing the Ceann Comhairle by secret ballot, distributing committee chairs on a d'Hondt system, resourcing committees with expert staff, making secretaries general and CEOs of state bodies legally enabled, empowered and obliged to fully account for their policy advice as well as their public administration. All of these things are doable within our constitutional framework. And the scale of modern public administration is beyond the capacity of politicians to effectively manage, and that is a fundamental fact that our system has never acknowledged or faced up to. We can't go on with a system of public administration and of politics. It's sort of akin to a dung heap, astride which is a cock who won't crow. And the suddenness with which ministers and senior officials succumb to Stockholm Syndrome in the mutual embrace of one by the other is truly astonishing. Our legislature, our government, are not in any meaningful sense countervailing influences one upon the other. Our system has little or any inherent attention. There's effectively one single morass, and it's founded institutionally on a historically inherited mutual convenience that serves none well. And this matters because institutions do shape culture. The flaccidness of our institutional architecture only succeeds, as sirens do, in luring the ship of state onto the rocks. Righting the wrongs of our institutions, redesigning the architecture of our public life would be of benefit. It is within our power to do. We should do it. But what is the reticence to do anything? And in a sense, the political reticence within the system as it is now reflects a wider public reticence, which is moral and which is that our society is repeatedly more interested in placing blame than in taking responsibility. And ours is a politics, I believe, where citizens as much as politicians repeatedly fail in their obligations. A serial subcontracting of responsibility to the Catholic Church, to the Irish government, to the European Union is a fundamentally false premise. We, the people, elect our politicians, and they then invariably insult our intelligence by doing what we want. And as having gratified us, we are appalled, we blame them, and we fire them. That's the ongoing sequence of events in Irish politics and the serial crisis that constantly recur. The washing of hands, the shifting of blame, which is so corrosive at the top of our system, is by those people at the top who are remarkably close in our very small society to the culture at the bottom and is en masse in everywhere we see in everyday life. This system, this broken system, is the cracked mirror through which we see ourselves. And in light of that, it's hardly wonder if sometimes we are appalled. Thank you.